Welcome back to another edition of Bad News, the media criticism show the right deserves. I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
Well, we're brought to you by the Federalist and the National Journalism Center, and we give the media criticism that is under absolutely no illusions that the media, as it stands today, the legacy media, can be reformed. And we want to reflect, at least briefly, on the media's coverage, on that note, of the verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial that was released yesterday. Now, take a look at this tweet that Ben posted. It is a good example of how the media framed this. All right. Our media in all its ingloriousness, Derek Chauvin found guilty of all three charges in George Floyd's death. With that sentence right there, this is from Axios' morning newsletter, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago. The big picture, the verdict is a landmark civil rights decision. Does that kind of cheapen other actual landmark civil rights decisions?
So many different directions to take this, but I think the two most important ones when it comes to media malfeasance with respect to everything associated with the George Floyd, Derek Chauvin case is, first of all, the trial itself pretty much had nothing to do with race. The substance of the story pretty much had nothing to do with race, unless you were looking at it from the perspective of race and you see everything through the prism of race, which of course the media does because it fits into, as you so rightly point out, the progressive or bigot binary that serves its political ends. And so making this a landmark civil rights decision when it basically had nothing to do with civil rights. I mean, you could make a case as a civil libertarian that this has something to do with policing. Okay. But obviously what's implicit in that in terms of civil rights decision is that this was a racial case. And of course, the president of the United States himself made his comments about the verdict in terms of systemic racism and that we're finally, starting to triumph over historic injustices and the like. But this was not about Black and white Americans, this case, based upon the substance of the proceedings itself, based upon what actually transpired. But the media frames it as such, and thus the narrative is set. And of course, this has been the whole narrative from the start of this is about essentially putting on trial America's past of racism and bigotry and irredeemable, deplorable evil, and using it as a political cudgel ultimately to drive home wokeism and the ruling class's entire agenda. And so the media, of course, serves as the ruling class's mouthpiece, and this serves as a perfect representation of it. And so it's a huge example of media malfeasance, and it speaks to the broader point, of course, of the media obscuring the focus from other aspects pertaining to this case, namely, for example, the incitement rhetoric of Maxine Waters, which, of course, now the media doesn't want to focus on incitement and they don't want to focus on the potential danger in words because it doesn't serve their political agenda here. And then more broadly, where does justice go from here to the extent that the jury itself felt the power of the mob potentially breathing down their necks? And we'll never know, was this actually an impartial and soberly, a decision that was come to impartially and soberly, and that is in no small part due to the media's coverage of this case. So they may have tainted justice themselves. And I'm not even commenting on the merits of the case or trying to relitigate the case, but just to say that the media had an impact ultimately, or at least created the appearance of having an impact on it in a way that does corrode justice by making potential future jurors, and not to mention police, of course, fearful in these sorts of situations.
Well, I think your tweet picks up on something, which is that, honestly, I really think media elites just navel gaze and talk in a way that sounds good to them, but in a way that's like also completely hollow. Like if you had a conversation with Mike Allen or whomever wrote that big picture line about whether this constituted a landmark civil rights decision, which would be like Brown v. Board, but we're talking about a case that literally was about one person's death, as tragic as it was. We're talking about a single person's case. This is not a Supreme Court case. This is not, it like literally is not even, there was nothing about race explicit in this case. And so while you can argue that it has racial implications, and while you can argue that it was an important moment for civil rights, to say that it was a landmark civil rights case seems just so stupid. And that's the problem. It's that like they spin their rhetorical wheels to the point where they're landing on meaningless feel-good phrases that are actually detached from any grounding in reality. And that does us all such a disservice, because basically the media just ends up flinging around different buzzwords that make them feel good and make them feel like they're advancing the cause of social justice. But it's a wildly unserious conversation when Mike Allen's big picture and his smart brevity that he blasts into the inboxes of elites and beltway power brokers and people around the country who want to feel like they're in the know of the Acela corridor. It's ridiculous. It's meaningless. And it's just something that you can see a center-left sort of neoliberal person just nodding their head, right? Like it sends the right message and they're just going to go ahead and nod right along with it, regardless of whatever it actually means, because it sounds good. On that note, I don't think we want to spend a whole lot of time talking about the Chauvin case. It needs to be addressed because the media didn't handle it particularly well. But I want to use it to segue into a conversation about CNN's tanking ratings, because I think there's a connection. The connection is that the media doesn't cover these cases well, and the public understands that. And I think CNN is a good example of a network that sort of sits back and their ratings are falling. And people should understand that CNN's website is a huge part of its business. So it's not as though they are like, freaking out and, over their plummeting ratings, because they still have their site no matter what. But a huge part of this reason is because the public has realized that they're not getting the full story from CNN. Even like I've seen people rolling clips from Fox over the past 24 hours, and because precisely there's debate. Right? Like Fox actually has real conservative and real liberal viewpoints. They even have real leftist viewpoints. And that is more entertaining and it's more productive on an intellectual level. And CNN can't even produce that. They can't even produce a real conversation where there are people who are genuine representatives of both sides of an argument, because they've decided one side of the argument is totally wrong. And that's why their ratings aren't going to improve. Brianna Keeler, on her first week as anchor of New Day, went on this ridiculous rant about Fox News's chyrons, which apparently show that they're not a real news network in her terms, which is hilarious because you're not a real anchor if you're going to wax opinionated about your competitor in this totally silly way, silly and unprofessional and just not intelligent way. And so I think this all goes to show that CNN has no hopes of improving their ratings unless they dispense with this progressive or bigot binary formulation that prevents them from hosting both sides of an argument, which again is both more entertaining and more productive. And I think the whole Chauvin case was a good example of that. People want real information and they want real debates.
Yeah, look, this is the market, rightly so, punishing the progressive monoculture that exists at places like CNN and, of course, more broadly across the corporate media. And I think there is an insight there, an important one that you brought up, which is that media and, of course, the consumers who at the end of the day allow media to exist in the first place and who the media is supposed to serve benefit greatly when there are actual genuine debates on the merits of issues. And frankly, the leftists, and we see this with Matt Taibbi and Glenn Greenwald and Michael Tracy's and Barry Weiss on the Substacks, it's the leftists, and of course there's a spectrum here, but it's the classical liberals, i.e. not the progressives, or even just old school liberals, Democrat liberals, and then the actual ardent leftists who in many ways are more intellectually honest than our ruling class progressives. And that's maybe it's in part because they've actually been bathed in ideas, and so they've maybe had to grapple with actually thinking about the world in a comprehensive way, or maybe even quarreled with and actually considered the ideas of their opponents. And so thus, they have a more robust sort of worldview. But I think more broadly for the viewer, of course, tension and conflict and provocative conversation is useful because it helps you think about things and how you're going to view the world and grapple with situations that you deal with in your own daily life and think about the trajectory of the country itself. So it's very clear that there should be a demand, and I think there clearly is a demand for real substantive debate, grappling with real questions, in particular in a time when there are an infinite number of subjects that you're simply not allowed to touch today. And we're all walking on eggshells. It's like comedy has died in large part because you can't say anything about anyone anymore, when the offensive nature of comedy was, of course, supposed to point out kind of the folly of human nature. And man, it's the same thing with media. At its best, it should exist to present arguments, both sides of arguments, because it brings out sort of deeper questions that we all have to grapple with in our own lives and then nationally as a country as well. And one narrow point, the comment from Papillon one, CNN can only hope Trump runs in 2024. Of course, that looms over this entire conversation as well, which is that if the media isn't informing or presenting debates, it's obviously about entertainment, and they've lost the entertainment value of Donald Trump. And they can't probe Joe Biden because there is plenty of entertainment, or at least maybe tragedy more so than humor, in the case of Joe Biden. And of course, delving into the raft of the substance of the policies the administration is engaged in, which is, as I've argued here before, and as I think you probably agree, one of the most radically leftist administrations ever in practice. But no one wants to delve into that. There's plenty there, but they can't focus on that, obviously, because it would undermine the whole narrative of trying to protect that leftism. So consequently, they're sort of in a box of their own making, which is that they really need Trump, and there was a symbiotic relationship with Trump, and it goes for all of these publications. So, I guess I'd say I'm glad that some justice is being meted out, that they don't have Donald Trump to kick around anymore, whatever the old Richard Nixon description was of the media. And I guess so. The question is, how does the media recover from this, or are they just a lost leader for the oligarchs like the Jeff Bezoses of the world that actually own these entities?
Well, I think there's no question that CNN exploited Trump to some bump in their ratings. And without Trump, they would have suffered a much bigger decline. But I also think their ratings still sucked under Trump in a way that even other networks, like CNN in particular is the best case study because they're the network that has, I think, been the most unhinged. And I am including MSNBC in that. And I watch a lot of MSNBC. It's my job. I basically leave it on in the background all day. CNN is a unique brand of awful because what they do is they have leaned into this very smug coastal progressivism in a way that is aggressively against the rest of the country. I mean, there is no effort to understand. There is no effort to empathize. There's no effort to include from a network, of course, that likes to speak lip service to the concept of inclusivity and diversity. There's literally none of that on their airwaves. MSNBC doesn't do a great job of including Republicans at all either, but they at least have much more substantive and less cartoonish and aggressively hateful conversations about the rest of the country. And I think that's where CNN in particular, when you have Breonna Keeler's rant about Fox News' chyrons, in that she's looking down her nose at Fox for covering things like Dr. Seuss and for covering the culture wars. And it's funny because Fox isn't covering that to stoke outrage. That outrage among its viewership, that outrage exists among its viewership organically. People are not so dumb that they need, their news source to tell them to get upset about Dr. Seuss. They are naturally upset about Dr. Seuss. Why? Because it feels very personal to them, because it makes them feel like the country that they know and love and that they grew up in and that they wanted to raise their children and their grandchildren in is slipping away from them. Silly as it may sound, that is actually the cultural anxiety that people experience when they hear things like, for instance, schools getting rid of certain Dr. Seuss books that they've really always loved, or libraries getting rid of that, or the publisher getting rid of that. It just makes people feel a sense of cultural anxiety. They don't need that to be stoked by the alleged cynics, in the C-suites of conservative media. They don't need that. That's organic. And Breonna Keeler not only doesn't understand that, she's mocking Fox News for understanding that. And so I think in that example is neatly encapsulated the reason that CNN is incapable of ever regaining a sizable audience. I think its niche isn't even ever going to grow, and it will grow, as you point out, it will shrink in the post-Trump era because there's less of that fodder on a daily basis to sort of froth over.
Yeah, my two brief comments in response to that are, it'd be interesting to know among our betters at CNN, what percentage of them have Dr. Seuss books on their children's bookshelves? And I bet you it's a decent percentage of them, although maybe not. Like their children's books like A is for Activist, literally, that exist today. The alphabet in wokeism, essentially. So who knows what they actually have. But of course, as we always refer back to Charles Murray and Coming Apart, he talks about the fact that our betters in the media do not practice what they preach. That is, they preach wokeism, but in reality, in their own lives, they live pretty traditional, like the traditional WASP American existence of the 1950s. So, of course, they're hypocrites when it comes to this. Then the other thing is, I think it is worth delving into at some point without playing psychoanalyst here, armchair psychoanalyst. Why is it that they so look down upon, the more than half the country that has its head on relatively straight? And of course, my response to that would be, it's that part of the country that is the only thing standing between them and total dominance over every single last institution of American life. And so the real reason they hate people, I believe, is not just that they think the rest of America is uncultured or unenlightened or the like, but it's that they're just so pesky. They won't give in to total progressive ruling class dominance. And so that's why they need to malign, smear, and target all of us to try to toxify us out of existence. But thankfully, I don't think us or any of our viewers or anyone in this broader ecosystem is going to give in that fight.
Yes, and I think that's completely important. And let me actually put this up on the screen. We have exactly how far CNN's ratings have tanked. There's a tweet there from Glenn Greenwald. Look at that. 34% of its total day viewers and 30% during prime time. I mean, that's just, from their perspective, the ad money that they must be losing. And the sad thing is we just sort of touched on this, but they don't understand how to right the ship. Like they actually just very fundamentally don't understand how to right the ship. In fact, anything they do, I think, will just continue to make it worse. Ben, do you have any final thoughts on that?
When your political adversary is drowning himself, let him go. So I won't say anything more about it.
Well, I have another tape to roll here. This is Yamiche Alcindor in the White House briefing yesterday, talking to White House spokeswoman Jen Psaki.
Representative Waters, as you said, clarified. She said, my actual words don't matter. I wonder why the White House isn't also coming to the defense of Representative Waters, given the fact that she's now facing an onslaught of attacks, especially by, I would say, Republicans. I wonder why the White House isn't saying, we back what she said about being confrontational. She was obviously not threatening violence. There are civil rights leaders that are saying that's what civil rights is to be confrontational, to be active.
Well, she also clarified her own remarks, Yamiche, and I think that's the most powerful piece to point to.
And one last question, if I could.
Okay, this is hilarious. It's classic Yamiche Alcindor. What's your reaction, Ben?
Well, first there's the element of this, which is sort of the tail wagging the dog of like, here's the media trying to push the White House or expand the Overton windows that the White House has the safe space to go into supporting the would-be inciter to violence in Maxine Waters. And of course, this is so rich with irony, the whole Maxine Waters saga, because this isn't the first time, her going into Minnesota and trying to essentially stoke the flames of confrontation there. Not the first time she's done this. Of course, there's infamous remarks about getting up in people's faces and making them pay and the like. And then, of course, you juxtapose this versus the people around Joe Biden talking about incitement to violence when the president says peacefully and patriotically go and make your voices heard on January 6th. And it's just so rich. Of course, it's made even richer by the fact that Biden staffers and Kamala Harris staffers and Kamala Harris herself pushed for bail during the 1619 riots of the last summer, for bail to be paid for the people involved in those riots who were arrested. So, of course, obviously, we all know the double standard here of when it comes to the left, they're perfectly fine with stoking mobs and actual insurrection across the country. And then, of course, they would attack the cops if the cops were to step in and do anything. When it comes to the other side, of course, it's presented an entirely different view. And of course, the other side doesn't usually engage in the kinds of acts that the left does, acts of political violence. But setting all that aside, it's just so rich that you have someone who's a purported journalist basically running interference for Maxine Waters and saying, Biden administration, you must back her and help her. And the Biden administration, meanwhile, has the political consideration of, we know that probably most of the country is not really with Maxine Waters on this. And so they have to toe the line between the left-wing activist in the room who usually runs interference for the administration, and then on the other hand, the fact that they know they can't really sugarcoat this to the American people. So I guess it was rich with irony, and it was enjoyable to see the tension there between the activist and the political class, which of course embraces those activists up until the point that it might inflict some political pain. But what it says more broadly about our media and the White House press corps itself is really breathtaking to witness that.
Yeah. And, I think I have a different perspective than a lot of people. A lot of conservatives did on the Maxine Waters comment. I sort of thought, yeah, it's ridiculous. And if it had come from a conservative, the media would have just blown it up. No pun intended. I mean, they would have been all over that 100%. So yes, but at the same time, what we're seeing here is taxpayer-funded hackery on behalf of Yamiche Alcindor, who benefits not only from a taxpayer-funded salary, but also from the imprimatur of neutrality lent by the fact that PBS designates her as a journalist at not a liberal outlet, not a progressive outlet, not MSNBC, but she is given the imprimatur of PBS as a White House correspondent, which everybody expects means neutrality and objectivity. And so those of us who cover media really closely, we obviously know that she's a complete hack. But the rest of the public doesn't necessarily realize that. People who are watching PBS NewsHour don't necessarily know anything. They probably don't even recognize the name Yamiche Alcindor. And so we can't take for granted what we sort of know as people who follow the media really closely about Yamiche Alcindor. And, a lot of people who follow the media closely know about Yamiche Alcindor, but a lot of people around the rest of the country probably don't. And what we saw in her question to Jen Psaki was just a full acceptance and embrace and advancement of Maxine Waters' defense in this situation, of the Maxine Waters argument, as though it is over. It is a closed question. Of course, she incited nothing because Yamiche Alcindor is a reasonable person, capital R, capital P, and a knowledgeable person. She's in the know. This is her job. So she's telling you what you need to believe, and she's telling the White House how they need to handle it, basically, is what's happening. So it's just a complete joke. It's upsetting to me that she gets away with it. It probably shouldn't be, but it's just, she's just a particularly grating example. Maybe because our taxes fund her and her network, but it's also just like the questions she asks, I think what's also annoying, are just so stupid. It's not even like good hackery.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head by talking about the fact that she has the imprimatur of PBS, which is supposed to stand for neutrality and objectivity. But I think it demonstrates how warped all of these institutions have become, and that you almost have to work under the assumption in your own mind that they are operating in bad faith, total bias and prejudice, and towards political ends. And then anything that doesn't support that standard is more the exception than the rule. And I think that's where we are today, and that speaks to the perversion of media from something that is neutral and impartial to something that is just explicitly activist, and that's among journalists and opinion folks alike. That's a sad commentary on where we are, but it does present an amazing opportunity for people who actually cover the stories that other people don't cover, or look at the angles that are missed due to the ideological blinders and biases of this monolithically progressive ruling class media.
Yeah, that's all great points. And it's, this is false advertising on the government's dime, and it's also divisive. So not only is it false advertising, but it's also divisive and corrosive behavior, and we're footing the bill for it. Unlike CNN, which is really just false advertising, and very powerful false advertising that sets the sort of agenda for big business and Washington, D.C., to the extent that it tries to do that, and reflects the priorities of people in charge of the country. PBS is false advertising, but it's on the taxpayers' dime. So I think that's what makes this particularly egregious. Any final thoughts today, Ben?
I think you just hit the nail on the head with that. We pay for this. We pay for this kind of propaganda to be pumped into our households and to create the appearance of legitimacy. So it's one thing if putatively private, and in this case truly private enterprises, are willing to throw money at networks that spew garbage, but it's a whole another thing when we are paying for it, and that is particularly enraging and grating.
Well, we thank everyone for sticking around for the show. We appreciate your time. We're here every Wednesday and Friday breaking down the worst of the media's behavior. If we sat here to break down all of the media's bad behavior, Ben, I don't think we would have time for lunch or dinner or sleep.
And I think our personal lives would be wrecked and we might drive ourselves insane. So that's why we try to limit it to a half hour every Wednesday and Friday.
We try. Well, again, we are a production of The Federalist and the National Journalism Center. This is Bad News, the media criticism show the right deserves. I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
Stay tuned for more.